Dog Works Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can find all of our episodes over on DogWorksRadio.com. Be sure to check us out on social media by searching DogWorks Radio. And today we're joined by my co-host. His name is Alex Stein, calling in from California. Alex, how's it going today?
It's going great, Robert. It is February now, so we have the Yukon Quest is going on, and the Iditarod is just around the corner. And I know that everyone is geared up towards that, and a lot of mushers are doing lots of things, lots of training runs, lots of getting ready for the race. But I know also that you have something very special that's going to happen before the race, and I think we're going to get to that in a little bit as well.
Yeah, boy, we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully we can get it all in on this episode here. Yeah, Alex, what we're doing here in just a couple of weeks, we're going out on the Serum Run Trail. It's going to be an 18-day adventure with 13 expeditioners, and we look forward to hitting the trail on the 22nd, and we'll arrive in Nome sometime around the 10th or 11th of March, bearing the weather, and look forward to crossing that proverbial finish line when we get there. I'm looking really forward to it. And I tell you what, Alex, it's been a heck of a lot of planning to get to this point, and we're getting trail reports in. At some places along that trail, it's minus 50 degrees below zero with open water, and in some places 4.5 feet deep of snow. So it's going to be really interesting to head down that trail.
And, just as a reminder for people, the Iditarod and a lot of big races like that in the Yukon Quest, they have a veritable army of volunteers and people out on snow machines breaking trail and doing all of that sort of stuff. And this expedition you're doing is different from that in that you have people who are certainly helping you out in a lot of the villages, but it is going to be much more the case that it's going to be kind of an old style expedition and a little bit similar to how the original Serum Run was run, in that you are much more dependent on each other and on the small support staff that you have who are traveling with you.
Yeah, we're going to literally be breaking trail along most of that 700-mile route. So it's going to be fun and interesting as we go. And I look forward to the reports after we get done. So, Alex, today we're going to jump into a bunch of information about the qualifiers. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do during Iditarod, and much more as we head into the busiest part of our season here on Mushing Radio. I think we're going to start with a quote that you found from Iditarod veteran Karin Hendrickson. Can you tell us what that is, and then we'll jump into it, please?
Yeah, sure. This is a post that she had on Facebook about the Willow 300, which is the most recent qualifier that she was running. And let me just read the quote, and then we can sort of dive into it. And I think this is really just a fantastic a fantastic quote, and it really gives a very clear insight into what this mushing lifestyle is all about. And she writes, "Success. The dogs and I finished up early, but we completed all our goals. We let the young dogs experience the excitement and chaos of a race, back-to-back runs, camping, and pushing beyond what they knew they could do. This is how young dogs learn to be tough racers. While we did not finish the race, the dogs ended on a high note, tired but still enthusiastic, just what I was aiming for."
Yeah, and you and I were talking off air. I've said that something very similar to myself many times when I've gone out there to do races and scratched or whatever. And you brought up a great point where you said it's not always about finishing in the standings, is it? It's about getting out there and doing what you have to do on sort of a larger or grander plan for the dogs. What are your thoughts on that?
I think sometimes there's a tendency for fans to see some of these qualifiers as like the regular season that leads into the sort of playoffs and World Series aspect or Super Bowl aspect of big races like the Iditarod or the Yukon Quest. And while I think that there is sometimes something to say for that, what I think this quote really tells us is that for a lot of people who are doing dog mushing as like a very serious endeavor, it's more about training teams. It's more about training your dogs for the future. And there is a lot more going on than just, trying to do well in the regular season to get ready for the playoffs, so to speak.
Yeah, you said it exactly right. And when folks enter these races, and we often call them the qualifiers, there are really two camps of it. There are the veterans that are out there, actually three camps. The veterans that are out there, the folks that are out there qualifying, the rookies, and then the folks that are running the B teams or the puppy teams or just out there to do what they want to do on the trail. And as you mentioned with Karin, she had that as a training run, and you'll often hear that from the veterans. They don't need this race to qualify again, or they don't need this race to improve themselves per se as mushers. So they use these as long training runs. And of course, not only are they putting in the mileage, but they're also out there to train their dogs around people and checkpoints and, people messing around with them like veterinarians and eating on the trail and all of that. All of that is pertinent to building a quality dog team. And I think that's what she was alluding to there. But on the other side, we have the folks that are out there trying to qualify. And just in the last couple of weeks, we've had a couple of qualifiers on our show, Eric Kelly and Susanna Tuminelli. And Susanna and Eric both did the Copper Basin, and then they both attempted to do the Willow 300. And unfortunately, Eric scratched on that Willow 300. So now his qualifiers are going to be pushed back for an entire year because you have to have those two 300s and then, of course, a 150 in there as well. So it can be triumph or it can be real heartache out there on the trail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a tendency, I know for myself, to look at these races and to just see them in terms of, what do these races tell you in terms of how many people finish, how many people, what position people finish in. And as you said, there's a lot more going on in these races, and it really depends on where someone is in terms of their competitive mushing career. And a lot of times, as we've discussed on this show, many times before, people scratch for all kinds of reasons. And some of them are maybe things that you could chalk up to being mistakes, if you want to put it in those terms, like not planning your run rest cycle as well as you could. But a lot of times, it's something that can't really be foreseen. It's a dog getting an unexpected injury. It's a dog getting sick or getting, kennel cough or something like that, or just weather. is frequently a huge factor. So it's because these races don't get the kind of coverage that a race like the Yukon Quest gets, or certainly a race like Iditarod gets, it's often hard to know exactly what's going on when someone scratches.
Right, and an interesting story out of the Willow 300 about Jim Lanier, and I know we talked a lot about Jim this past season. He was told that he can't run Iditarod, and he had to requalify all over again, even though he's a multiple decade veteran of both the Quest and the Iditarod. Well, he did the Willow 300 this past weekend, and when he pulled into the checkpoint, folks were coming up to him and they wanted to help take off his booties of his dogs and all that. And he said, "No, leave my dogs alone. I've got this. I will take care of my own dogs." And he did that deliberately, Alex, because if one person touches his dogs, that can be considered outside interference, and it will disqualify him from using that race as a qualifier. But he did very well, and at 79 years old, was in one of the top places there in the Willow 300 on a very cold, very chilly weekend up here in Willow. But he did what he was supposed to do. He qualified again for Iditarod and will be out there again, I assume, next year. What are your thoughts on Jim?
More than a couple people looking at what Jim did posted on Twitter and various other places that they wanted to be Jim Lanier when they grew up. And, it is hard for me as a relatively young man to be out there when it's 30 below or 40 below or 50 below. The idea of someone who is Jim Lanier's age being able to do this and do it very well, and do it, while he's not winning these races, he is finishing in a very respectable, very, very solid middle of the pack position. That's just remarkable. And someone posted, I forget who it was, but someone posted a photo of Jim, who apparently, after finishing this race when it was bitter cold, went to a local bar where there was a band playing, and he and his wife were up there, and he had a beer, and he just went out on the dance floor and was dancing with his wife. And there's that's a level of toughness that is just really, really admirable. And my hat is off to Jim Lanier.
Yeah, mine too. And people always say, "Robert, when are you going to run Iditarod?" And I say, "Hey, I've got 30 years to meet up with Jim Lanier's age. I'm only 48, 49 years old, so I still have 30 years in me before I need to get out there and do that race for the first time."
So earlier you learned about First Paw Coffee Company, and now I'm going to tell you about its Tail Wagger Blend. First Paw Coffee Company's Tail Wagger Blend is their first offering, and its name and label were crowdsourced from their Facebook fans. How cool is that? The Tail Wagger Blend is a private label premium blend that was developed just for them. It is a medium roast from Colombian beans with tastes of Brazil nuts, grapefruit, and oak. Be sure to go to ak.dog/free and enter to win a bunch of cool prizes. That's ak.dog/free.
So let's talk a little bit about the Yukon Quest, which is going on right now. And it's a really interesting race because only 15 mushers entered. It's by far the least amount of mushers that's ever entered into this race. It started in the mid 80s. Of course, there are a couple of big names still in the race: Brent Sass, Ryan Olson, Cody Straith, Rob Cook. All of those folks have run it a few times, and it looks like right now Brent Sass is in Dawson City, as well as Michelle Phillips, which is the halfway point. Have you been following the Quest at all?
I have been, but not really closely. I know that there are a bunch of people who withdrew from the Quest right before it started, giving us this really, really low number of mushers running, number of teams. It's interesting to me that we've seen, for example, Ali Zirkle, who is not running the quest, but is serving as a handler for her husband, Alan Moore. And I think that's really cool. In past years, she has run the Yukon Quest 300, while Alan has been running the big Yukon Quest, the 1,000-miler. So that's kind of cool. But it's been sort of an interesting race to follow. It's always interesting to follow, but because of the huge number of miles that people have to, not the teams, but the handlers and others have to log in order to help out on the Yukon Quest, it is a little bit more difficult for journalists to cover than say a race like the Iditarod.
Right, and there's an interesting story about one of the rookies in the race, Olivia Webster. It's her grandfather. She happens to be married to Iditarod champ Hugh Neff, and her grandfather, Leroy Shank, is one of the founding members of the Yukon Quest. And her goal in running this race is she wanted to run this race and finish while her grandfather was still alive. And I guess her grandfather's in pretty bad shape. He has Parkinson's disease and whatnot. But it's interesting because Leroy, her grandpa, and Hugh are the handlers for her on this race, and they're driving that multiple thousand miles to do the handler duties for this. And I know we've talked about that before, but he's along on this race for the first time in a very long time, cheering on his granddaughter, who hopes to finish this race in his honor. I think that's a pretty cool story, isn't it?
It really is, and it's really inspiring, and I think speaks to how this lifestyle of dog sled racing really, runs in families. We've seen, for example, the Mackeys, where many generations of the Mackeys are involved in dog sled racing. We've seen that with certainly the Seavies, and it's just cool to see a family like this, where it's not necessarily focused on Iditarod, where a lot of the attention goes.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over the next 4 or 5 days or so. As we mentioned, just a couple of teams are there in Dawson City, which is about the halfway point. And remember, folks that are listening, every year the Yukon Quest flip-flops. So they'll start this year in Fairbanks and finish up in Whitehorse, and then next year they will start in Whitehorse and finish in Fairbanks. And each musher has their preference on which way they think is best. Some like to leave from Whitehorse, others like to leave from Fairbanks. Of course, there's a heck of a lot of huge mountain peaks that they have to summit, and many, many miles out on the trail alone in order to do this race. So I know it doesn't get near the coverage of the Iditarod, but it's a fun race to follow, and the Yukon Quest really does a great job, especially on Facebook, with keeping their fans up to date, and they really do a great job, don't they?
They really do. I wanted to just mention that Jason Campo, who scratched from the Yukon Quest a few days ago, had a very, very cool post about, he was injured going over one of the summits in 2018 in the Yukon Quest, and was back this year and had this long post about how well his dogs did and how proud he was of them getting over the very place where he was injured last time. And he wound up going back to a checkpoint and scratching because some of his dogs had some minor injuries, and he was scratching so that he could make sure that he kept them all in good spirits and in good health for when he's going to run the Iditarod in a few weeks.
Yeah, that goes right back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, about some folks using races as training runs. And that very well could have been the motive for for Jason there is to make sure he just had that healthy team to be able to do the other big race here in just a few weeks. Alex, let's switch over to talk a little bit about the Q-Paws racing series. They've done 2 races so far of I believe it's their 4 races that they're going to do this year. They did the Bear Grease in Minnesota, which is pretty much the premier mid-distance race in the lower 48. And then they did I believe they call it the Finnmund race over in Norway, which is a longer race than the Bear Grease. And while they're doing excellent in terms of their coverage, they really had quite a bit of a growing pains with their trackers, and they're trying to put a heck of a lot of new and innovative information out on the trackers that just isn't working out as they should. But have you seen the coverage that they're doing on Facebook and on YouTube and that studio and with Dallas? It looks like CNN Central over there, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good looking setup that they have, and they really seem to want to take this to the public in a very professional way. And we're a little bit spoiled looking at things like ESPN Sports Central and looking at the way a lot of other big sports are covered. And then you compare that to the way some of the larger dog sled races are covered, and it's very clear that there's a lot more money in football than there is in dog sled racing, and I like that they are attempting to level the field. And I think that by making the coverage look more professional and look a little bit more expensive and less like it was something that was thrown together on a shoestring, my hope is that will help bring in more fans and more money and more awareness to the sport.
The first thing I thought of when I was watching that coverage was seeing Dallas Seavey there at the Bear Grease, and we always compare this sport to others, and you had talked about the Super Bowl and whatnot, and I think about like Monday Night Football. You always have the Don Meredith or Frank Gifford or one of the old grizzled football veterans in the booth, Chris Collinsworth, for example, on Sunday Night Football, to give that analysis. And that's what I was thinking about Dallas and giving his expert color commentary of the race. I thought that was so cool. I'm sure he would much rather be out on the runners. I know that the Q-Paws folks said that they wanted to pull him off the trail. He was scheduled to run in the Bear Grease, but they wanted him in the studio instead. What do you think about that? About the boss saying, "Hey, you've got to do this and not that."
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, because if you consider just from a financial point of view, he's probably, and I don't know this for sure, but this is my guess, that he is probably making more money doing this commentary than he could make doing, competing in these races. But as you said, Dallas Seavey is someone whose heart is with the dogs and whose heart is in being on the back of the runners. So as much as I think that he's really good at television and he does some of these things really, really well, I've got to think that in the back of his mind, he's thinking to himself, what am I doing here when I could be out on the trail?
So they're also doing 2 other races, and one of those races is Iditarod. And, Iditarod does a decent job, especially with the Insider, and, they have the videos that are coming up on Iditarod.com with Danny Seavey and whomever is the reporter for the year, often speaks on video. How do you see it playing out with this coverage on, as they say, the granddaddy of them all, the Iditarod?
I think it's going to be very exciting to watch. And, the idea of Dallas Seavey, even though he's not competing, basically making a return to the Iditarod is very interesting to me. There was one year, I believe it was 4 or 5 years ago, when Karen Hendrickson, whom we spoke about earlier, was injured and was not competing. She did the commentary at the start, and it was so good. It was so much better than it usually is. And the idea of just having someone who has done this competitively very recently and who knows the ins and outs of not only of the sport but of most of the competitors and of the trail, I think is going to bring an extra aspect to the coverage that we don't see.
I'm so jealous that I'm going to be missing a good portion of that, being out on the Serum Run expedition, which is going to parlay into our next topic here in the last few minutes of our show. We are going to do our daily coverage of the Iditarod here on Mushing Radio. We've been doing this now for a heck of a long time, you and I know that you're going to handle these duties on your own, or possibly with my wife Michelle, who's very versed in the podcast industry, I guess, at least on the dog training side. What are your thoughts coming up about our coverage? And then we have kind of a special announcement of a project that you're going to work on that we'll talk about in just a second.
Yeah, I am looking forward to it. I'm starting to do some research for the Musher profiles, which is one of my favorite things about the way we cover the Iditarod. And it's hard to believe that it's going to be coming up in just about a month from when we're recording this. But I'm very excited about it. It looks like we have a very, very good field. It's sort of a medium size field. It's not super big. It's not super small. And there are quite a few mushers who I think are going to be very, very exciting to watch.
I'm looking forward to joining you when I arrive in Nome at about the 10th or 11th, but your first show is going to be Friday evening, March 6th, and typically that first show is we'll talk about sort of our thoughts about starting the race, who our favorites are, and just sort of that general consensus of what's going to be happening over the next couple of weeks. And then we'll air that nightly show. And as we mentioned, you're going to be in the wheelhouse by yourself, it looks like, for several days. And then we'll meet back up at about the Wednesday or Thursday of that first week. And then we'll carry on through the Finishers Banquet, which is something special that we do that a lot of media does not do, in particular on radio and newspaper and on podcasts. We go until the race is over, don't we?
We do, and a lot of people will basically just go until the winter comes in, and then there are some who will go a few days after that. But it strikes me every year how there's still a race going on, and it's a very important race for the people who are still competing for the Red Lanterns and the people who are really the back of the packers in the last few days. And it always strikes me as kind of strange that people are packing up and going home when there's still a race going on.
So lastly, Alex, I heard that you're doing a pretty cool project. I know you've been talking about this on Twitter in particular for the last couple of weeks or so, but you're doing something like trail stories. What is that all about, and how's it going to be presented?
So I am writing a series of very short pieces. Some of them are fiction. Some of them are creative nonfiction. So they're not specifically based on one thing, but they're based on a lot of different things that are non-fictional, and they're relatively short. They're going to each be about 5 minutes long. One or two will be a little bit longer. There's probably going to be, at this point, I would say about 10 to 12 of them, and I'm going to release them every day or every other day during the Iditarod race. And just as an example, there is one that's called Diary of a Team Dog, and it is a piece written from the perspective of a team dog on a sled dog racing team, talking about training and what they think about when they're out doing a training run. So I'm very excited about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and definitely let people know where they can get those and listen to them.
So it's only going to be audio, is that right?
Yeah, only audio.
Excellent.
And I've been previewing a couple of these at storytelling shows in Los Angeles, and so far people are really, really excited about them. So I'm very happy to be able to share these with people.
So, Alex, I know that you're a storyteller, a professional storyteller by trade. That's what you do as a job. What do people think about stories about sled dogs, Iditarod, and whatnot in a place like Los Angeles? You would think that you would hear different types of stories than about snow dogs.
Generally, you do. And I think that actually works in its favor, because this is, every time I've done one of these stories, it's something different. It's a view into a world that people don't know about necessarily, or they don't spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think that there's a way to bring people in. I don't expect everyone in Los Angeles who hears these stories to become a fan of Iditarod, but I have had dozens of people come up to me and after I've done these stories and say, this is really interesting. I want to learn more about this lifestyle and about dog sled racing.
What is the guy's name, Alex, that did the movie in Starbucks? He's a late night comedian or something. He did that sled dog movie with the folks in Starbucks.
Oh, right. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know what you're talking about. It was very funny.
It was hilarious. And that's what I was thinking about when I asked you that question, because that was obviously in LA or New York or somewhere. And it was quite the skit. And you can definitely find it over on YouTube. Alex, we're just about out of time. Anything in closing?
I just wanted to say that Nick Pettit is definitely someone that we should be keeping an eye on. I think that he's going to have a fantastic Iditarod, and I'll make my predictions closer to the race, but certainly this is someone who I think we're looking at a top 5 finish.
Oh yeah, he's won 3 Willow 300s in a row, finishing this one that we were just talking about earlier on in the program. Yeah, he's always a force to be reckoned with, but I think this may be his year.
Yeah, and he's always someone who is right up there at the front, but I think that it might be really, really hard to beat him this year.
Excellent. On behalf of my co-host today, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto for Mushing Radio. Be sure to check us out over on dogworksradio.com and wherever you find your podcasts. We will talk to you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.